So how does Hopkins's poetry compare to the poetry of the other lyric poets we've read in this course? His poetry is something anomalous. There's not much like it before, and there isn't much like it that's come after him. He's got this idiosyncrasy, and I think that this is perhaps one of the only things that his poetry shares in common with Dickinson's poetry. That and the fact that the two poets often preferred the Anglo-Saxon word to the Latinate. Where Dickinson startles with impending punctuation, Hopkins shocks us with a boisterous rhythm. If you look at Wordsworth and Coleridge, where Wordsworth wishes to tame our excitement into this visionary calmness, Hopkins accelerates that excitement into an apotheosis of ecstasy upon which the visionary powers are dependent. Now, this is one of the reasons why T.S. Eliot, I think, thought that Hopkins's poetics weren't very sustainable. It works for certain topics, he said, certain modes of consciousness, but in that regard, Hopkins is really the poet of ecstasy. But there's something not quite right about Eliot's assessment of Hopkins, and I think in our seminar discussion, we could put some pressure on the way Eliot um, assesses Hopkins' poetry, because he's actually got quite a range. So that's for Wednesday, though. But in this course so far, we've progressed from the philosophy of Plato all the way up now to the lyric poetry of Gerard Manley Hopkins. Two more authors until the semester is complete. That's J.R.R. Tolkien and Elizabeth Bishop, and then on to the summer course on Yeats and Shakespeare. So as not to repeat my previous lecture on Hopkins, I want to show how the poetry of Hopkins was the result of a theological conflict that warred with Hopkins really up to his death. But something happened to really enable the poetry, enable a reconciliation between what he thought was an overlove of nature and the right relationship to God. So here he is on the slides. There's Hopkins, the Jesuit priest. This is a dilemma that many Christian poets have faced. How does a Christian poet reconcile their love for the beauty of the material world with Jesus' world-renouncing commandments in the gospel? Hopkins was born an Anglican Protestant. He was at the Church of England. He was a part of the Oxford movement when he was at Balliol College, Oxford. Now, this movement is often called Anglo-Catholicism because it was a Protestant movement that sought to revive some of the rites and rituals of the medieval church before the Reformation. And like John Henry Newman, who started out very pro Anglo-Catholic, he converted to Roman Catholicism, eventually became a cardinal. And this is what Hopkins did. He converted to Roman Catholicism and he joined the priesthood. When he became a Jesuit, he burned all his poems in an act of full commitment to God and his church. And it hurts to imagine what is lost to us now because of this decision. But we have to try to understand it. Because if the spiritual life is to be prioritized over material enjoyment, then a love for God should exceed the love that one has for the world, even the natural world, even creation. Each poet makes his or her peace with this, I think, each devotional poet. Dickinson certainly did. One of the demands that the evangelical religion made of her was that she should renounce the world, but she says she loved the world too much, and by the world she meant mostly nature. It was interesting. We don't really think of the two being in conflict, but that's how it was for a lot of poets in the 19th century. And you can see the intensity of this love reflected in Hopkins's letters. So to a friend Bailey, he wrote this: I have particular periods of admiration for particular things in nature. For a certain time I am astonished at the beauty of a tree, shape, effect, etc. Then when the passion, so to speak, has subsided, It is consigned to my treasury of explored beauty and acknowledged with admiration and interest ever after, while something new takes its place in my enthusiasm. The present fury is the ash, and perhaps barley in two shapes of growth in leaves, and one in the three boughs, and also a confirmation of fine weather cloud. This is this is a man really obsessed with the particular beauties of nature. I just want to highlight here, you can see in a different shade of color, the words particular periods for particular things in nature. For a certain time, I'm astonished at the beauty. He talks about a passion, so to speak, that's exciting. We think of Wordsworth's kind of excitement over the rainbow or over certain cloud formations and trees. Admiration, interest, enthusiasm. That with passion, all four of those are very religious words. Enthusiasm was a term for religious frenzy that arose out of the late 17th century. And then listen, the present fury, his obsession right now is the ash tree. And it's like as he gets going, he starts making chains of association, and perhaps the barley, he says, and two shapes of growth in leaves, and one in the tree boughs, and also a confirmation of fine weather cloud. He's got this obsession, this love for the beauty of nature. And this is really the problem. That Hopkins felt this spontaneous enthusiasm for the created world, and he worried that it eclipsed his love for God, that he was making an idol out of nature. And one wonders why not just see nature as a means of an analogy of God, as the poets had been doing for some time? We saw this in Emily Dickinson's Reformed tradition. The whole Calvinist movement that came from England and was in America had a rich tradition of analogy. In fact, Hopkins's uncle, Thomas Marsland Hopkins, co-authored a book of poems that exemplified an infusion of religious sentiment with observation on the natural world. It wasn't very popular. His uncle was the curate of St. Saviour's, Paddington, and it was published in 1849 under the title Pietas Metrica, or Nature Suggestive of God and Godliness. So their method was the analogous way. And we saw this with Jonathan Edwards in the American typological tradition, where we were reading in the Bible course we recently hosted that that Edwards would sometimes see a still lake and he would say, "Oh, this corresponds. This is symbolic of the spiritual state of complacency." Or he would look at the blossoms on a tree and he would say, "Well, this reveals to us about God fruitfulness and sort of his love for beauty." It's because of this equals this higher idea. That's the hierarchy between the natural world and God in this scheme. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, his concept of the symbol countered this approach because he argued for a more living and symbolic conception of nature, not one based on analogy, but one that was symbolic, where God is actually like cohabiting the object itself, or that there's a translucence about it by through we see God. It's difficult to think about, but they were all wrestling with this tradition, and Hopkins is in his own way. So apart from containing some poor poetry, this volume by his uncle participated in this reduction of nature to spiritual object lessons. And he was cautious lest his infatuation with nature should exceed his devotion to God. But the solution came, and it was a theological solution which enabled this new productivity of poetry. And it was in the summer of 1872 when he was already a seminarian, a Roman Catholic seminarian, looking through the seminary library, and he comes upon Duns Scotus, the medieval Franciscan theologian. And he and it's Duns Scotus's theology that enables him to return to poetry and to see the world in a new light. This is how he describes it. At this time, I had first begun to get hold of a copy of Scotus on the sentences in the bodily library, and was flush with a new stroke of enthusiasm. Notice that word again. It may come to nothing, or it may be a mercy from God when I took in any inscape of sky or sea, I thought of Scotus. So this quotation mark shouldn't be here. It's all one quotation. I just omitted some sentences there. And this is from the journals and papers of Hopkins. So there are two concepts from Duns Scotus which are important: univocity and haecceity. And I'm going to unpack that. So here's Duns Scotus here in his Franciscan Brown. Scotus's doctrine of the univocity of being undergirds this connection. Now, univocity means identity of the same identity. So unlike Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas, who maintained that terms like good, wise, or being applied to God and creatures only analogically, that is, in a similar but not an identical sense, Scotus says no, the sense is identical. And this is how it changed Hopkins' view, because Scotus contended that these two terms must apply univocally, meaning in the exact same sense to both God and creatures. So when we say God is good or a person is good, the term good applies in related but not identical ways. Scotus argues that unless there is some univocal or identical concept of being shared between God and creatures, we cannot reason coherently about God. So if you were to say that God is beautiful, that would be meaningless if the word beautiful didn't carry at least one stable, shared meaning across all beings. So univocity does not mean that God and creatures are of the same kind of being. It means that the concept of being applies uniformly to God's being and creation, the creatures who are finite. Because the term being means something utterly different when said of God and creatures, no meaningful metaphysical bridge can connect the two. So for Scotus, then, being is the most general and inclusive concept. This allows his metaphysics to serve as a science of being, which includes both God and the world in its scope without disrupting the distinction between the two. So instead of a one-to-one correlation of the nature to God, saying, okay, well, this is a type or a picture of the spiritual realities, it's like, no, the spiritual realities are there in the type. And so it seems in some ways very similar to Coleridge's concept of the symbol. And I know this is kind of heavy-handed philosophy, but you all have read Origena. So I know you can make these necessary connections. You're probably even thinking a little bit about Origena too, in his panentheism. And I think that's right. Duns Scotus is known for his Neoplatonic bend. So that's one out of two terms. The last and second term is haecceity. It's from the Latin meaning thisness. It's kind of related to quiddity. Herbert has a poem called Quiddity, which means the whatness of a thing. And that's what gives a thing its individual being that's uniquely itself and not another. So in Scotus's metaphysics, haecceity is it's not like an attribute, it's not a property or quality like a color or shape. It is this metaphysical principle that grounds the individuality of a being beyond its common nature. It's what makes Socrates Socrates and not another instance of humanity. Without haecceity, individuals would not be indistinguishable copies of a form. So Scotus's idea affirms the irreducible particularity of every creature. Notice how focused it is on the particularity of sensation. So two oak trees may share in oak treeness, but they are numerically and individually distinct. And what gives each its unique, irreducible identity is haecceity, the thisness of a thing. So for this, Hopkins just was all over this. This really enabled his own sense of what nature really was for him and what it had always been. This provided a theological permission, really, to love the natural world. Because the natural world arises, according to Duns Scotus, from God's will and reveals his attributes, and it also becomes for Scotus a theologically meaningful reality, not one in a hierarchy below necessarily, one that participates in the whole unity of the world and all of reality, spiritual, physical. Though one cannot know God's essence directly, Duns Scotus, I think, would say, and by that he would agree with Aquinas, one can ascend from nature to God by way of rational reflection. And by rational, I don't mean logical necessarily. I mean like a meditative, contemplative sense, like in the way St. Bernard uses rational as a form of contemplation. Uh, and this ascent is the journey that the poems attempt to make. So, okay, let's see how this works in one of his famous poems, As Kingfishers Catch Fire. So, just to read this before we begin, it's a wonderful sonnet. As kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame. As tumbled over rim and roundy wells stones ring, like each tucked string tells, each hung bell's bow swung finds tongue to fling out broad its name. Each mortal thing does one thing and the same, deals out that being indoors each one dwells, selves, goes itself. Myself it speaks and spells, crying, what I do is me, for that I came. I say more, the just man justices, keeps grace, that keeps all his goings graces, acts in God's eye what in God's eye he is, Christ, for Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limb and lovely in eyes not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces. It's an astounding energy to this sonnet, because it is a sonnet. We have the octet separated here from the sestet with that interval. The octet functions analogically through similarities, as kingfishers catch fire. Instead of saying, though, as kingfishers catch fire, so does God catch the sinner, that would be an analogical reading. But no, he associates it within a network of the one reality. As kingfishers catch fire, so do dragonflies draw flame, just as stones ring tumbled over the rim of roundy wells. I love that line. The nature of things is likened into the nature of other things because they're all sharing within the same experience. This is not a denial of the spiritual, but rather a collapsing of the binary that we often have. How often do you hear the term spiritual life? It's all one life, really. There's really no distinction. I think that's what's being collapsed here. Each mortal thing, there's that thingness here, does one thing. And notice how the noun and the doing and the verb have become one. This is the thisness, the individuality of the thing. The opening stanza of this poem suggests Scotus's doctrine of haecceity. Every being possesses this irreducible thingness, this thisness, which makes it this, not that. Hopkins translates this into poetic rhythm. Each thing selves. I love the way it chimes with dwells. Selves, goes, itself, myself. It speaks and spells. All the selves are acting within their own nature. The birds, the stones, the dragonflies. It's all expressing a singular identity. And Scotus wrote, that individuation is not an accidental feature. It's instead essential to the integration or the integrity of creation. The word integrity goes back to integer, meaning oneness. So it's integrity here means something more like wholeness. If a person has integrity, it has like a moral wholeness. Hopkins echoes this, it seems. Like you can see the theology at work here, suggesting that each creature cries out its identity not in this analogical way, but rooted in that self. Selves go itself. Myself, it speaks and spells. Myself, he's a poet, so what does he do? He speaks and spells. And since we're in the Poetics of Enchantment course, we know that this is one of the positive spells, the kind of spells that bring about a visionary insight. But the poet poets, crying, "What I do is me, for that I came." The self selves. Thus the noun of the thing becomes the verb of the thing. Action and actor indistinguishable. And I love his description of writing poetry as speaking and spelling. As the kingfisher fishes, the dragonflies draw, and the stones ring, so does myself self. Right now, Adam is atoming, teacher teaching. Last week we saw antidos learning to antidos. And when you act according to your true nature, you are youing. This is all kind of silly, but silly in the way that Hopkins sometimes got in his sermons. You should think about what it means for you to you. I told my students, we had the last day of classes recently. I said, Harvard will tell you to be all kinds of things, but what matters is that you act according to your true life. And the old Quakers had a saying, I mentioned this last week, let your life speak. I think Hopkins might have said, let your life speak and spell. So that's his activity as a poet. And with the sestet, it all comes down into a Christology. It all becomes kind of grounded there. What's key here is that Christ, who's the second person of the Trinity in his theology and, well, in Orthodox Christianity, participates in the individuality just as much as the kingfisher. And this is where it starts to push the radical. Is that Scotus's concept of haecceity also undergirds his idea of the incarnation, of the divine logos taking on flesh. And this is where we would connect it back to that second week of our course with St. John's Gospel. The St. John's poetics, theology really, is really informing both Scotus and Hopkins's own poetics. As each individual possesses a unique thisness, so too does the human nature of Christ have its own haecceity or haeccetos. Christ plays in 10,000 places. Lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes, not his. And what does that mean? That he plays in 10,000 places. I think Scotus's doctrine of univocity supports this incarnation idea. That if being is said in the same sense of God and creatures, then there is no categorical barrier in union between divine and human. This opens up this conceptual space for the hypostatic union to be intelligible. Univocity provides this semantic and metaphysical scaffolding that allows the incarnation to be the most coherent expression of God's desire to be known and loved in creation. And that's where Scotus comes in. Is that it's ongoing. It's almost like the incarnation itself is not only in the incarnation, which is very similar to the stuff that Coleridge verges on in The Statesman's Manual when he's talking about the symbol. So the incarnation is not contingent upon the fall for Duns Scotus. This was one of the radical things that Hopkins found really compelling about his Christology. Duns Scotus said that, no, the plan always was that God would become man. That would have happened with the fall or not, which is a radical idea that also goes against Aquinas and pretty much how the church has conceived of the incarnation in its own way as a response to sin. But he says, no, it would have happened anyway, so that God was intending upon this marriage. So you see how there's this perfect marriage of nature and God in Scotus's idea. And what's going on here, too, is we can see nature as being incarnational. The traditional view implies that God endured to take on nature, human flesh, as something that he never would have otherwise done had he not been compelled to save mankind. And Scotus's view understands nature to be the mantle of God, even if salvation was not needed. And this was a new idea that Scotus introduced. So I've said a lot about Scotus, but I want to be clear about something. Hopkins doesn't parrot Scotus. I'm not saying that Scotus made Hopkins's love, or invented Hopkinson's love of nature. He really made it permissible. And more than that, Scotus gave Hopkins a way to develop his own framework of one of his most important concepts, and that is inscape. So inscape for Hopkins is this quintessential individuality of a thing, very much like the Haecceity, thisness of things. John Ruskin, who's another Victorian critic and a contemporary of Hopkins, coined the term pathetic fallacy. You've probably heard of it. This is not that. Hopkins is not the pathetic fallacy. When poets, the pathetic fallacy is when poets project onto nature their own emotional states. So this is what Ruskin says about it. He's the one who coined the term. Thus, for instance, in Charles Kingsley's Alton Locke, and he quotes, "They rowed her in across the rolling foam, the cruel, crawling foam." The foam is not cruel, neither does it crawl. The state of man which attributes to it these characters of a living creature is one in which the reason is unhinged by grief. All violent feelings have the same effect. They produce in us a falseness in our impressions of external things, which I would generally characterize as the pathetic fallacy. This isn't what Hopkins is doing. His vision discovers the vitality that's already present in the object, and this is his visionary poetics. He doesn't project onto it. There's this great passage that Robert Bernard Martin, in his recent biography of Hopkins, selects to demonstrate the way Hopkins sees. Notice how this contrasts to the crawling foam from Alton Locke. This is from Hopkins's notes. The water running down the lasher violently swells in a massy wave against the opposite bank, which, to resist its force, is defended by a piece of brick wall. The shape of the wave, of course, bossy, smooth and globy, full of bubble and air, very liquid. For the rest of the lasher, all except the shoulder where it first sweeps over it, is covered with a kind of silver links, running like a wind element at the shoulder. He's watching a lasher, which is a stream that's boisterous over a weir, and he's at the Wolvercote outside of Oxford, watching this happen. And the way he's documenting it, he's trying to capture the inner essence, the movement, the pattern of the thing, its unique design that makes the lasher, and not something else. So we can see him developing this before he even comes across the theology of Duns Scotus, which allows him to link it to his own theology. So in Hopkins's poetic and theological way of recognizing and naming the thisness of a thing is what we would call, or what he calls, inscape. Hopkins isn't always very consistent when he uses the term inscape. People have written about it, trying to come to a synthesis, but it tends to mean that every object in the world has this inscape, which is an inner identity that shines forth through its outward form and behavior. And this individuality is the cause of celebration in pied beauty, which teaches a right devotional response to haecceity, the thisness of a thing. Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of coupled color as a brinded cow, for rose moles all in a stipple upon a trout that swim, fresh fire coal chestnut falls, finches' wings, landscape plotted in pieced, fold, fallow, and plough, and all trades, their gear and tackle and trim. All things counter, original, spare, strange, whatever is fickle, freckled who knows how, with swift, slow, sweet, sour, a dazzle dim, he fathers forth, whose beauty is past change. Praise him. So he gives us this proper response to beholding the inscape, and this is how he marries it to his whole theological vision. We talked about sprung rhythm in the other lecture on Hopkins that I have on the YouTube channel. But here we're going to scan this. We'll see it's trochaic pentameter. Glory be to God for dappled things. And this comprising the second half, the last foot of the trochee there. It's really unsettling, disruptive, boisterous. For skies of couple color, as a brinded cow. Some things which are remarkable here. I mentioned Hopkins's preference for the Anglo-Saxon. It's pretty integral to his sprung rhythm. He liked the rhythms of Old English, which is also Anglo-Saxon to say, and he believed that there was a vitality in medieval English, in Old English, that modern English lost, and he's trying to recover that. Skies, it comes from the Old English scale, not heaven, which is also an Old English word, Hifron, which is also Old English, but has spiritual connotations. This is very, very physical, and yet the simile with the sky to the brinded cow, it verges on irreverent. It's as though we witnessed the collapse of the spiritual physical binary. Rose moles all in a stipple. Rose moles or freckles. And you know, those trout with the freckles on their backs, all in a stipple. A stipple is a way of dotting a piece of paper with the tip of the pen. Illustrators use it, so it's an artistic effect. But it reminds me of the way John Clare described the eggs in his poem, The Yellow Hammer's Nest. He says, 5 eggs, pin scribbled o'er with their inky shells. If you look up the yellow hammer eggs, you'll see it looks like somebody dipped a very sharp quill in ink and then scribbled over, just randomly like that. A fresh fire-cold chestnut falls, finches' wings, landscape plotted and pieced, fold, fallow, and plough, and all trades their gear and tackle and trim. Notice how the polysyndeton, the use of 2 ands when he really could have only used 1, helps us to slow down, kind of catch the rhythm as he's coming to the end of just this one period. A fold is a slight hill or hollow. Fallow is a plowed but unsowed ground. Of course, the plow is an instrument used to turn up the earth before sowing the seeds in the earth. It's also linked to poetry itself. Both of these poems I've chose for this lecture have to do with poetry in some way. The Latin versus, from which we get verse, means to turn the plow, kind of furrow in the land. And when we think of furrowed brows, we're participating in a tradition of metaphor that goes all the way back to Shakespeare's Sonnet 2, probably even further. When 40 winters shall besiege thy brow, and dig deep trenches in thy beauty's field. Talking about old age and the kind of wrinkles you get on your brow. It's all going back to this metaphor of furrowed brows, of the verses. So the plow is associated with poetry here. All things counter, original, spare, and strange, whatever is fickle, freckled, who knows how, with swift, slow, sweet, sour, a dazzle dim, he fathers forth. He fathers forth, whose beauty is past change. Praise him. Hopkins expresses somewhat of a paradox here. God's beauty is past change, yet he creates a world full of changeable, diverse, immutable forms, pied beauty. The inscape of each thing reflects a glimpse of the unchangeable beauty of its creator. Now, that way we get the analogous effect. But it's also fused. This moment fuses inscape, the unique design of each thing, with in stress, which is our act of perceiving or praising that design. The fathering forth is also connected to the Christ, the eternal procession of the Son being fathering forth at all times. And remember the Kingfisher poem. Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces. So I think what we have here in Hopkins's poetics is this visionary poetics, which are somewhat of a sacramental ontology. It's like the world is sacramental. Everything becomes a sacrament in a way. And it's because of Duns Scotus's metaphysics that makes this possible. Christ, the incarnate one, manifests in the uniqueness of each individual person through the 1,000 features, through the features of men's faces. Precisely because of the incarnation, united God with nature through this irreversible intimacy. And it also matters for him that this was the plan all along. It wasn't just a response, a reaction to the fall. So in Hopkins's poetics, it seems to me, and I'm not sure if he really figures this out, but it seems to me, or reconciles it, that the incarnation is what continues to unfold symbolically. The poetics comprise a metaphysics in which each created thing reveals its divine vocation of being itself. It's the self-selfing, and the whole creation speaks almost with the voice of Christ. And I'll conclude there, but I'll say that the reason why I say I'm not sure if Hopkins really figured it out is because in so much of his poetry, there's still a tension, as though he's either not convinced or he's trying to convince himself of the certainty of the way he's reading nature. And it seems to me there's something just a little unsettled. Perhaps because he was so alone, comparatively, in this way he was viewing nature. Duns Scotus wasn't much respected in 19th century Roman Catholicism. So it could very well be that he's very much on the margins. He's developing something on its own. But I put that out for consideration for when we discuss Wednesday. Okay, for everyone on YouTube, thanks for joining us, and until next time.